Professor Wergely's here. We're going to take a look at Angular. We went over Angular, the slides and lecture. May try to create another video to kind of go back over the background of Angular. These will be good quiz questions as well as exam questions. So you will want to know the concepts of Angular and spend a little bit of time reading the docs. Now, there's great Angular docs. I keep talking about them here on angular.io. The docs include this getting started. You should read what is Angular, then go over the setup, and then go over the try it. There's about 5 links here, and they're fairly short. So you'll see they're just a few paragraphs with some coding examples. You'll want to understand how Angular works. I have a great lecture about mustache, which is basically interpolation for Angular. I'll see if I can get that up so you can understand interpolation better. But you'll see here, here's a directive. It's basically like a for loop. Imagine if there was a for loop outside of this div, and essentially for every product in the products array, so imagine there's 10 products, it's going to create a individual div. So it's going to create a div for product number 1. It's going to create a div for product number 2. And it's going to output the name for each product. So product would be like a JSON object. The JSON object may have a name, a price, an amount. How many of those products do you have in inventory? So interpolation is saying, grab this variable, whatever the name is, output it as a string here. So if you had PHP, you can imagine this would be like an echo. And if you had PHP, you can imagine a for loop on the outside of this div, a PHP for each that goes through all the products, let's say from the database, and then basically generates a corresponding div. What's cool about Angular and all the modern frameworks is they have functional programming. So this for loop here, I can have actual functional code that does something like if statements, for loops, while loops, whatever, inside the HTML file. That's what makes Angular so powerful. And then here, I don't have to echo or call a server-side script. I can basically have similar server-side programming without embedding server-side code. We're now using Angular, and we're embedding Angular in our front-end code. And Angular is a TypeScript or JavaScript framework, so it would be considered front-end. Back-end would be like Node.js or PHP, server-side coding. This is not server-side coding. This is front-end coding, but it allows us to have powerful code. You'll see here, I only wrote what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of code, and this is what it outputs here. So it's very powerful. With 6 lines of code, I can output products from my store. So you want to read the docs, read about navigation. You need to use the router in the challenge. It talks about how to do router and router link, which you'll need for the challenge. It talks about managing data. I don't think you have data for this challenge, but you'll still want to read this, how to collect input from forms and managing the data, and how to deploy the application. This is probably the hardest part of the challenge. Once you write the coding and get it implemented correctly, now you need to go and deploy it on your server. And the biggest thing is the white page of death. If you remember in 3330, I called it the red wall of death. In Angular, you'll get the white page of death, which means none of your pages load. And a lot of the times that's from the base href. We'll talk about that another video. I actually have a video to deploy your application on the server and how to get it to work. And I talk about fixing the white page of death. You won't want to change anything in the code. You'll want to do that from the command line here when you do a build. And that's all discussed in another video. So in short, go back over the slides, read this tutorial, get familiar with Angular. In this video, we're going to start coding. So you want to come over here to lecture number 10, and we're going to start by installing Angular. So if I come to the docs, we're going to follow the setup here. You need to be able to use JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. You need to know TypeScript. Okay, you need to know TypeScript. You'll see it's helpful but not required. Technically, you can still write JavaScript code in TypeScript, but it would be better if you wrote proper TypeScript. It's kind of like writing Python. You can write Java-like code in Python, but they have what's called Pythonic code. So if you write Java-like programs in Python in an interview, they're going to know that you're more of a Java developer, you're not really a Python developer. But if you write Pythonic code, well, then they know that you're very familiar with Python. Same with TypeScript. They have a tutorial here, just typescriptlang.org. I recommend going over it. They have examples and how it would look in JavaScript and how it would look in TypeScript. And it's a great tutorial. So follow that, go over this. If they ask you to read the article, that's definitely a good article to read. So first you need to install Node. Okay, you want to install the latest stable version. So if I come over here to the link, you'll see here's the releases. I just go to the home page and then download this one right here, LTS. Go ahead and download it. We actually did this in the lecture. You'll see I have it here, but I'll go ahead and replace it. Then open it up and go ahead and run through the procedure. You'll see it's installing Node.js and NPM. I'm doing this on my local. Technically, you could install it on the server, but it's okay to build Angular apps on your local. And then once you're done, upload them to the server. So I'll install. And you'll see here, one sentence here, make sure that user local bin is in your path. So if I come over here to the terminal and come back to my local, I believe you can just do path like this. And you'll see here, I do have user local bin. Normally it adds it for you, although sometimes you will have to add it yourself. And the path file is going to be in your bash RC if you're on Linux. On Mac, sometimes it's in the bash profile. On Windows, I believe you can set the path in the Windows UI settings. They actually have a UI that you can set the path. You'll do a Google search and you'll find some good documents for Windows. But on Mac, you literally put path equal to this in the bash file and it'll work. Once Node's installed, you can check this out on your local. So you can do node-v. You'll see that's the version. You can also do npm-v. Make sure that it is a newer version. So we're on node 14.17 and npm 6.14. Now, what's good about installing the latest version is when you come back, it's going to ask you to install the Angular CLI. You'll see it's with npm. Now, if npm is an older version, you're going to get possibly an older version of Angular. So you'll want to make sure you stay up to date and get the latest version of Angular. If I come and install it here, normally if you do a -G, which is for globally, installing it globally, you'll need to usually do a sudo command. On Windows, I believe you can use PowerShell or git bash. But you can install npm commands in Windows. So once you have npm installed, you can literally run the same command as I am in Windows. If you did it through, what is it called? The Windows console or the Windows command line, you can open up the command line as an administrator. That way you don't get any errors. So you see I'm on Angular CLI 12. If I come over here to the web and look at Angular current version, you'll see the latest stable release is 12.1.4, and we have 12.2.7. So as long as you're in Angular 12, you'll be fine. Okay, as long as you're at Angular 12, you should be fine. So now you'll want to get familiar with Angular CLI. And basically it tells you how to do it here. To generate an app, this is the Angular CLI, ng new. To run the app, ng serve. To build the app, ng build. So you'll want to learn the Angular CLI commands, and you'll want to get used to them. There's usually 3 main commands, which is ng new, ng serve, and ng generate. Those are the 3 main commands. So if I look at Angular CLI, you'll see ng generate, that's a common command, ng serve, and also ng build to build the application. So you'll see common CLI commands. Go over this doc. They actually have more information here, so you can actually look at each individual command. They have a lot of commands, ng add, ng test, but normally you'll just have a few commands that you'll use. Sometimes you'll use some of these other commands. So I'm going to go ahead and generate a new app. Now be careful where you do this. Make sure you create a lectures directory or a challenges directory. So I'm going to go to my lectures directory, and I'm going to make a new directory. I think we're on lecture 10, and you can put intro to Angular. CD into it, and you'll want to get used to command line. So it's going to be ng new, and then we're going to follow kind of the overall structure here. So if I do the ng new, you'll see it's basically new or n with the name of the project. So if I go back to the overview, or even just going back to getting started, setup, they actually have a test app. So you can do new, my app. You can install a test app. We can look at the test app real quick. So if I just do test app, it'll give you some instructions. Do you want to use Angular routing? Normally you're going to put yes. For our first to-do list, we're actually going to put no. And then you have a choice. Do you want to do CSS, SCSS, SAS, or less? I tend to choose SCSS because you can write CSS code. You can also write SAS. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. So I tend to pick SCSS. You'll see it's installing. Normally they give you some options to download the example application. They usually have an example application. You'll see here it's been installed, and it actually creates a master branch for you, which is awesome. And then it says to CD into the new directory. So if I do an ls, you'll see CD into test app. And then to run it, so here's the app. To run it, I just do an ng serve, and that's going to just serve it on my local machine. I believe they have some test pages there, but I actually want to show you a test app. They do this with Ionic too. Once we get into Ionic, they build kind of an app for you that has a bunch of stuff, basically all their functionality, so you can see how they wrote the code. And then you can take pieces of that code and use it in your application. Looks like if I do new Angular Tour of Heroes, which is a common app to do, a lot of students do this for their exploration. They do the tour of heroes, or they do a to-do list. That's a common thing to do. And then they build on top of it. So you'll see once it's done, it's going to be running on localhost port 4200. So I come over that in the browser, localhost 4200. You'll see they basically have the test app. They show you a nav bar. They have some different elements here, and they tell you how to generate your next component. This isn't the little test app I was talking about. Let me try it with, if I do a Control-C, whether you're on Windows or Mac, Control-C, it's going to terminate that app from running. And now if I refresh the page, you'll see it's gone. So it sets up like a little node server on your local and then runs the Angular app on the node server, which is one reason you have to install NPM and Node. Let me try to get out of the test app. And let me try to do an ng new with the tour of heroes. Let me see if that's a little demo application. That it's asking me for Angular routing. I don't think it's going to generate the demo app. Looks like here is the Tour of Heroes completed application. They have the hero editor, get data from server. So they do have a lot of examples here. So I guess if you wanted to see the example, you can go over here. Stack Blitz is cool. You can actually look at Angular code and then it loads over here on the web. So here would be the example code and you can download this on your local. I recommend you keep a local version. You'll see here, this is what students do for their default page, for their exploration. You can see I can add a hero, it adds, I can delete. You can see it's basically like a to-do list. Here's messages. So it has some default code. And I don't know if it's using material. It looks like it's just using basic HTML and CSS. If you added material here, which is a common thing to do, they actually have an Angular material library. So you'll see Angular material has a library where you can do basically most of the material components. You'll see getting started here. You just basically do an NPM install, and then you add the modules that you want to use. So you do an ng add Angular material, it'll add it for you, and then whatever modules, like if you want to do a material slider, you'll add that into the import for the corresponding TypeScript file. You can also use Bootstrap, which we'll use at the beginning. Later we'll use material. So here's the Tour of Heroes. So you may have to download it from their website instead of doing ng new. So I'm going to go ahead and download this, unzip it. I'm surprised they don't have a GitHub repo. And let's go ahead and see if this runs. So I don't think this one ran, but we can try it. ng serve. If you do -- open, it should open the browser automatically. You'll see it takes a little bit. If I come back to this example application, you'll see in each component, there's only a few lines of code. Here's 12 lines of code. And in the TypeScript file, here's just a few lines of code, maybe 20 lines of code to get this to work. Again, here's 20 lines of code. And in the TypeScript file, so you can think of this as JavaScript, here's 20 lines of code. This is all default code and imports. So you'll see here, whenever you add, it's going to take the name and it's going to trim it. You know, if the name is null, then return. Otherwise, we're going to add it to hero service. You'll see service files. What's good about Angular is it's separated into model view controller. So basically, here's the view. So here's your HTML file. Here's the view. The TypeScript file is also kind of considered your controller. This would be considered your controller. And then if you have a service file, which this one does, you'll see it's hero service. So if I go to the service file, this is kind of like your model. The model has the data. So you'll see here, I have a hero service. You'll see I have a constructor. And then you'll see I have get heroes, which is an observable list. So it updates in real time. And you'll see it's actually making an HTTP request to API heroes. Observables is more for updating elements in real time. You don't have to use observables. We will start using observables when we get into Firebase. This is pretty high level Angular. Right now you can keep it basic where it kind of looks similar to JavaScript. Here it's pipes and HTTP gets. You don't need to do any of this at this time. Later we will use this when we get into Firebase and more difficult concepts with Angular. But you'll see everything's separated. So I basically have an app. Inside my app, I have components. These are called components. So every page, the dashboard is a component. The heroes page is a component. And you'll see a component has a CSS or SCSS file, HTML file, and TypeScript file. So it has these three, which is nice because it separates the code and it's very structured. That's one thing I like about Google and their corresponding languages or frameworks. They're very structured. So here's basically your view and your controller, and then the service file is your model. So it separates into MVC very nicely. You'll see here's the details or the search. Everything's a component. So if you go back to the Angular slides and scroll down to that example that we went over in class, you'll see this example here. So here's, let's say the nav bar is a component. The breadcrumbs is a component. The search bar is a component. The product list is a component. And then each row is a component where you have the image, the department component, and the price. And you can see a nice hierarchy tree. So that's the same here on their application for their hero example. The search bar is a component. And what's nice about making this a component is you could use this search bar anywhere. So I could use it on the heroes page. I could use it on the dashboard. And it basically breaks each element of the page down into an individual component. But each page can also be a component. So here's the heroes page. You'll see I have an H2 up at the top, my heroes. So if I click on this, you'll see my heroes. Then you'll see I have an input. I have the button. And then I have an unordered list with all the heroes. If they click on a hero, you'll see I'll navigate to a new page. If I click on the little X, then it's going to delete the hero. You'll see on click. This is like a JavaScript on click. So once they click, it's going to go to the delete function in the TypeScript file, which is here. So it's going to take that current hero. It's not going to return anything. And it's going to find that heroes in the list and then go ahead and delete that hero. And notice it's all in the service file. So if you want to do proper MVC, the service file will control all of the data. Remember model view controller? The model is going to be the data. The view is going to be the front end UI, which is going to be your HTML and CSS. And the controller is going to be the middleman. So this is going to be basically like your controller. Notice it's just calling methods in the model, just like we did in 3330. So if you're not familiar with model view controller, make sure you go back over it. There's a lot of good resources out there. You'll see Chrome has a good page here. It talks about model view controller. The model never talks to the view directly. It's the same with Angular. And notice they're using the Angular to do application to explain model view controller. We're going to be creating this here in a little bit. This is a good article to read. I also recommend reading the Oracle article. This is the documentation that explains it with Java, but it has pictures and it also is similar to the Google article. But what I like about this is it has code and it's separated into its own files. So it explains MVC in a Java-like concept. And then you can really see MVC in an Angular app because it's separated into all these individual files. So here's example apps. I recommend you go over at least one and look at the code, see how they wrote the code. try to understand the code. But a lot of their code is complicated. We're going to do a simple Angular app. Let's see if I can run this one on my local. What you tend to do, I don't know if they included the node modules, but you'll CD into an Angular app. If I do an LS, you'll see there's no node modules. So what you always do if you download an Angular app, and the TAs have to do it too, is you do an NPM install. Make sure you install the node modules. Once you have the node modules installed, then you can run the app. Node modules are very large, so everything is put in this package JSON file for all the node modules that you need. So instead of passing the node modules, which you'll see here in a little bit, it's probably several gigabytes. You pass this file over that says what node modules you need, and then whenever you put it on the server or wherever you need to install it on your local, you do an NPM install. Whenever you put it up on the server, if you want to run the compiled version, you do an ng build, which will include all the node modules and packages that it needs. It'll compile it back down to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which are the languages of the web, and then you load those files up onto your server. So you'll see once this is done, we can go ahead and now do an ng serve, and we should be able to run the Tour of Heroes app on our local machine. This is what I always do when I look at a new framework. Go and to their website, follow their tutorial, and go and download their demo app. Look at the code, try to understand how they built the code, because Google is the one who currently owns Angular. So they're going to have the best examples to use. Yes, you can use other tutorials. There's other good examples out there, but definitely Google is going to have the best example. So you'll want to look at their tutorials. You'll see this is live. So if I go to my local machine and try to run it, Stack Blitz is cool too, but I like to store a local copy in case they take it down. You'll see it runs just like it did on Stack Blitz. So if I do test, you see I can add. If I do a refresh, you'll see test is gone. So it's not a persistent application at this time. Normally, if you have some default data, you'll see they've added a TypeScript file here for mock heroes. And this is where the default data is coming from. A lot of times they'll put it in the assets directory. You'll see Google put their data here in this TypeScript file. Normally there's an assets directory, and you would include, let's say, a JSON file or some default data in the assets directory. Although having it in a TypeScript file also works. Okay, so we talked about Angular. Let's make our first Angular app. Stick with Professor Wergeles, and we'll see you in the next video.